All right. Today we're going to be looking at some mechanisms that control evolution. Now, we know that evolution is genetic change over time, but Hardy-Weinberg principle tells us that, hey, genetic change is not going to occur unless something causes it to occur. So, what the heck causes genetic change to occur in populations? Well, you already know one thing that causes genetic change, and that's natural selection. Hey, as organisms survive, their traits become more and more common in the gene pool. But if organisms don't survive, well, then they can't pass on their genes, and their genes become less common in the gene pool. Thus, we're going to have this automatic situation where some genes are going to become more and more common, some genes are going to become less common. Selection, turns out, is going to be the major process by which genetic change occurs in all populations. But there's a few others as well. Now, anytime an organism moves into or out of a population, it's going to bring its genes with it. So, every time you have movement of organisms into or out of a population, you're going to have some change in gene frequency. Admittedly, this is going to go ahead and have more effect on smaller populations than larger populations. Hey, but it still has an effect. Now, you're familiar with selection, you're familiar with migration. This is a new term, genetic drift. Genetic drift is defined as a change in gene frequency due to some chance event. Now, this might be some natural disaster. Obviously, if a volcano, a flood, a fire happens in an area, it might not matter what types of traits you have. It's a matter of survival. Could be just a question of pure luck, being at the right place at the right time or the wrong place at the wrong time. Either way, some genes are going to be eliminated, and it might have nothing to do with the types of traits that you have. In addition, you might have a situation where, for no particular reason, an organism either fails to find a mate, or maybe they find a mate and have much more offspring than they normally have or normally would have. Either way, we're going to have some changes in gene frequency. Another thing that's going to cause changes in gene frequency is mutation. Let's face it, if mutation happens, you're creating a new gene that wasn't in the population before. So by definition, any mutation will cause a change in gene frequency. Now, the four factors we've mentioned are the ones that are the major ones in causing gene frequencies to change, with selection being number one. However, if you have some situation where you have populations that become separated and isolated from each other, any of the four that we previously mentioned become much more magnified, as situations on one or in one population might not be faced by the second population. For instance, if this population of birds over here, separated by a mountain range, have different selection pressures here than we do over here, we might have a profound difference in the gene pool. And it's not just mountain ranges, it could be a river, changing course. It could be a dozen different reasons why populations might actually be separated. More about this later, because this is going to have huge implications for macroevolution. So hang on to that. Now, as I mentioned, the major impact in changing gene frequency, the major factor that's going to affect genetic change is going to be natural selection. Well, let's look at a population here and look at some patterns of selection that could possibly occur. Generally speaking, if we're looking at populations, most of them are not only have a variety of traits, but also a variety in the degree that they'll express that trait. Here we've got mice that range from light fur all the way up to dark fur, right? And everything in between. Generally speaking, when we try and graph these populations as to the degree to which they express the trait, you end up with the proverbial bell curve. In this case, most of the individuals, or the majority of the individuals, are going to be expressing the moderate or medium form of the trait. But you might have some at either end of the extremes here. In this case, we've got a few light-colored mice, a few dark-colored mice, but most of them are somewhere in between. Okay? This would be true for people, shoe size, height, a variety of different traits. Usually we'll show this pattern. So, what could happen? Well, if selection is indeed operating, sometimes the selection pressure, that is, the genes that are removed, might be predominantly from one side of the gene pool. For example, if perhaps maybe some predators preferred these mice, maybe because they were easy to see or easy to catch, or perhaps they had something that didn't allow them to survive some environmental condition like extreme cold or whatever, we might selectively remove these genes from the gene pool at a greater rate than their counterparts. The net effect would be that the darker mice would become more and more common, and the lighter mice less common and perhaps even eliminated. We're actually going to push that bell curve in one direction or the other. Another possibility is that perhaps both sides of our gene pool, both sides of our bell curve, are going to be eliminated at the same time. The selection pressure is against, in this case, the dark mice and the light mice. The net effect is that these genes become less and less common, but it also means that the surviving mice all are more or less the same color. We're going to reduce the variety here, and we're going to produce organisms that have a more uniform trait. They're all going to kind of sort of look more and more alike. And yeah, you guessed it, we might as well go with our third option. You could have some type of disruptive selection. For some reason, perhaps the lighter mice and the darker colored mice both have a greater ability to survive in different situations. And we're going to be eliminating those medium forms of the gene. If the average forms are selected against, and obviously the light forms and the dark forms are going to become more and more common. But here's the cool thing. You could end up with enough differences among the two groups so that they could actually end up being two distinct groups that no longer interact. This could be the beginnings of a new species, or leading to what we would think of as macroevolution. Now, more about this in a later segment, but the idea of disruptive, stabilizing, or directional selection become really, really important in determining what's happening in gene pools and in the evolutionary process.